Today's guest is Kevin Adler. Kevin's new book, When We Walk By, Forgotten Humanity, Broken Systems, and the Role We Can Each Play in Ending Homelessness in America, is a must-read guide for ending homelessness in America. As the founder and CEO of the nonprofit organization Miracle Messages, Kevin leads a global community of volunteers and referral partners who have successfully reconnected more than 800 people experiencing homelessness with their loved ones, matched 300 unhoused individuals with volunteers for weekly calls and texts, and launched one of the first basic income pilots for the homeless in the U.S.
Hey, Dave, you're going underwater. Look at your camera.
Oh, sorry. There we go. Now I'm back. This has resulted in more than 2/3 of those folks getting housed. Kevin's work has been featured in New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, on a billboard in Times Square, and in his TED Talk. Kevin, it is truly an honor to get together with you virtually here. Welcome to our podcast, and I can't wait to have this conversation.
Yeah, me too. It's a kindred spirit, despite being a Bills fan. I won't hold that against you. So
Yeah, at least we're in different conferences.
that's right.
Yeah, the 49ers, right? Yeah.
We can meet in the occasional Super Bowl, and I mean, if we met recently in the Super Bowl, we might both lose somehow. I don't know how that happened.
Right. Yeah, just
we'd both find a way to lose.
Yeah. No, I get that. So, hey, Kevin, I've read your book, and just find it, when we walk by, and just find it fascinating. Thank you for putting that together, and I'm gonna have it ordered for all of our board members. It's a must read, and our staff too. It's a must read, even for those that think they know what the reality is. It's definitely a must read, and I encourage our listeners to definitely order Kevin's book when we walk by, and give it a read. Um, I know from reading your bio, or I'm going to make a presumption that you yourself have not experienced homelessness, but you've had a journey, and in part a personal journey as well. How did you get to where you are today, in terms of the amount of time and effort and spirit that you're putting into this issue?
Oh yeah. Great to be with you, Dave. And yeah, it's a blessing upon blessing that I have not spent a day of my life experiencing homelessness. Uh, you know, Tough moments certainly, but always had family or friends that I could kind of fall back on, and those support systems had the resources to make sure that I was able to not end up on the streets. And in fact, we have this question we ask all the time on homelessness: why are so many people experiencing homelessness? Equally important question that never gets asked: with 1 out of every 2 Americans a paycheck away from not being able to pay rent, and 40% of people saying they don't know where they'd get $400 for an unexpected emergency, we almost have to ask, well, why isn't half the country experiencing homelessness? Why isn't tens of millions of people on the streets? And we do find that family, friends, community, church, synagogue, mosque, relationships, social capitals, likely making up that difference. My journey into this issue begins with relationships, specifically with my uncle. My dad's younger brother, Uncle Mark, he was, my favorite member of my extended family. He remembered every birthday, guest of honor, Thanksgiving and Christmas, loved super burritos. And we just talk at length about our shared love of all things Mexican cuisine. But, he also suffered from schizophrenia, and he lived on the streets of Santa Cruz for about 30 years. And I got a phone call one day while I was in college from my dad, and he was was calling, and he was sobbing. And he said, Uncle Mark has been found deceased. He was 50 years old. And so, yeah, Dave, my journey on this issue really begins like thinking, gosh, everyone I'm walking by, that's someone's son or daughter, that's someone's brother or sister, that's some kid's beloved uncle. And 10 years ago, 11 years ago, when I started this journey, I didn't see people experiencing homelessness as, somebody as people to be loved. I saw them as problems to be solved. And so my journey on this work over the last decade has been getting close enough to our unhoused neighbors to hear their stories, see their humanity, recognize not only parts of my uncle in their journey, but parts of myself and other members of my family, and realizing that our unhoused neighbors are our neighbors. And through relationship, we've been able to do a lot of good work at the nonprofit I started, Miracle Messages. So
Yeah, let's talk about messages. I see that you founded it. It's well, almost 10-year anniversary,
yeah,
right?
this
Come,
December, it'll be 10
yeah,
years.
right.
Yeah.
10-year anniversary. So it's helping folks that are experiencing homelessness and specifically in rebuilding support systems. And in your book, you talk about, and I want to mention something about St. Vincent de Paul after you expound on this. But you talk about the concept of relational poverty. You talk about relationships that you had with your family, but you use this term relational poverty. Can you talk to that? What does that mean?
Relational poverty, I think of as a type of extreme loneliness, extreme isolation, but often accompanied by a level of stigma and shame, where if you don't have the relationships, you're totally isolated, disconnected. There's a stigma that makes it hard to form relationships. It can really be a life or death situation for people who are on the
Hmm.
margins of our society. So relational poverty is poverty. But we often don't think of it that way, And when we think about how many people are paycheck to paycheck and doubled up and tripled up and couch surfing and barely getting by, it's in large part relationships that are keeping our society together, the fabric of our country. So for our neighbors experiencing homelessness, the quote that I heard early in my journey on this work was one individual said, "I never realized I was homeless when I lost my housing, only when I lost my family and my friends."
Hmm.
And that was kind of this light bulb moment for me, Dave. And what I realized is that for many people in this country, it's social supports, relationships. That's kind of the last buffer before falling into homelessness. And if you are homeless, you could have lost that, or your family and friends didn't have the resources to support you, or there was a falling out, whatever it was. And then a person who does experience homelessness, it's so isolating and otherizing. It's almost inconceivable. The most memorable cardboard sign that I've ever seen, some guy wasn't even holding it up. He was kind of sitting down and the sign was slouched against him. He was kind of had his head in his hands. It said, "At least give me the finger."
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Can you imagine that?
Acknowledge me. I'm here. Yeah.
Like a middle finger in my face, like but I'd rather have that than what I get, which is totally ignored, feeling invisible. So to me, that is relational poverty kind of manifest, and I think we have to talk about it if we're going to talk about ending homelessness.
It's interesting, and I just had an email come across my desk this morning from the National St. Vincent de Paul Society about the importance of the work that we do across the country in home visits. So, for those that don't know, uh, the basic beginnings of a society in a community is at a parish level. It's at a grassroots level. People that want to help, and the society was founded in 1833 by Frederick Ozanam in Paris, France. His college student, and his buddy said, you Catholics talk a big game, but what do you really do?" And he got challenged by it. And so he created the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. And one of the first rules that they put in place was that we will do house visits. We will go to those that we're going to have relationships with. And part of it was, yeah, we're bringing food, and we're bringing clothes, but we're sitting down and having a conversation. We're
Mm,
sitting down and trying to get to know the person. And I see that in your conversation about being seen, being heard, because we get phone calls that come in here in Louisville at our Special Works campus every day, and it's people wanting assistance, But what the ladies that tell me that answer the phone, you know what they really want? They
Mm,
want to talk to somebody
mm,
and they have a
mm,
conversation with them.
mhm.
And that's why I'd like to shift and miracle to this to the phone buddy program that you have, because I can see similarities in that. And this also this notion of providing monthly income. Can you talk to that? Because it sounds like it's just an amazing success.
Yeah, I'd love to, and that is, thank you for sharing that story. It's really powerful. So, a little bit about Miracle Messages work and how we've evolved our program. So it started out, me getting to know our unhoused neighbors, hearing their stories, and hearing over and over again people talk about distant loved ones, family, friends, people who they missed, they didn't hadn't talked to in years, if not decades. And I began offering, hey, would you like to record a message to a loved one? And happened to meet the first guy I met, hadn't seen his family in 22 years. He recorded a video. I found a group connected to his hometown, posted the video, and within a few hours, the video went viral, made the local news. Turned out he had been a missing person for 12 years.
Mm.
And his sister got tagged in the post, got on the phone the next day. And she said she hadn't talked to her brother in 22 years. And so got them reconnected. That was the first of what became Miracle Messages. And we've now done over 900 reunifications, where a person who's experiencing homelessness wants to reconnect to a loved one, or vice versa. We get family members that reach out to us saying, hey, my brother Bill I haven't seen him in a few years. Last time I saw him, he was in somewhere in Louisville. Can you help me find them? And so through that search process, we have a network of volunteer digital detectives. So these are folks who do online searches, sleuthing, find loved ones. So that's our reunification services. Uh, from that program, we also recognize that, for some people, family isn't an option. Sometimes family is part of the problem, not part of the solution. And that's where we created a phone buddy program,
Mm.
where we match everyday volunteers all around the world, not even around the country. We got volunteers in Europe, Asia, Africa, Latin America. They commit 30 minutes a week to have phone calls and text messages one-to-one with an unhoused neighbor. It's kind of like a digital pen pal kind of program. And then from that program, we ended up creating a basic income program and direct cash transfer program. Can talk about in a minute, but I'll just close kind of this thought with a quote. This is from one of our volunteers, who is in our phone buddy program, and it really speaks to a little bit of what you were experiencing with the kind of call center operators and people just being lonely. So this is what he said. He said, "Well, I cannot take any credit for his friend's recent success. I can tell you nonetheless that when we started this journey together a few weeks ago, he was so depressed, despondent, and lonely that he was texting himself, actually sending messages to himself from one of his phones to the other."
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
gosh, right?
Right.
Like early in the pandemic, I heard an unhoused neighbor was, kind of asked about social distancing, and the whole thing. He said, "You don't need to teach me about social distancing. That's my life already."
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know?
Right.
So that's the work we do, is to try to bridge those gaps with our unhoused neighbors and us, because as disconnected as they are from their loved ones, we are disconnected from them and they are disconnected from us, and we're all, one community here. So
Let's talk about that a little bit, because you do talk about this in your book, um, about the how should I say this? The Can I use the word dehumanization?
yeah,
Cobbling together individuals with individual stories into just this homogeneous group of people that are just they're just out there kind
yeah,
of thing.
yeah.
And what you talk about kind of the genesis of that, where that comes from. Um, and again, I really want our listeners, anybody that is coming into this, if you're new to this, is to get Kevin's book, When We Walk By. How does that happen? I mean, and you see in history where groups of people can be dehumanized. We saw it in Nazi Germany. You see it where it happens, right? Is it kind of the same thing? Where we just kind of treat them as a group and it's easy to just put them over there and I can't do anything about it kind of thing?
Yeah, it's an important question. I think of it like this. We talk a lot about homeless people as kind of a monolith, like a homogenous group, as you said. If we flip it for a second, imagine let's talk about housed people, right? Like imagine you and I walk into a room, it's like, oh, look at that housed person, right? You'd be like, what? And even within us, like, are you a homeowner? Are you a renter? Are you doubled up? Are you cost burdened? Are you in the process of moving? Like, where do you live? There's so much variety, and yet we have defined an entire group not only by it's not even what they have, it's what they don't have, their
Yeah.
lack of stable housing. And so, when you're talking about homelessness and you talk about the homeless, and that includes, a woman escaping a domestic violence situation with her child, and that
Yeah.
includes, a person who is just laid off and can't, find another job and is unemployed and unemployment's running out. A person who had a catastrophic injury, work related, cancer induced financial toxicity was a thing I had never heard of, but a young person aging out of foster care. One out of every three kids who age out of foster care experience homelessness by the time they're 26 years old. And for Black young kids, that goes up to 60%.
Oh,
So, and then, yeah, someone who has got a prescription of opioids perhaps, and now is addicted and can't relinquish that, or has a severe mental health issue. Like all of this, we have clumped together into this monolith called the homeless. It's actually ridiculous, right? Like it doesn't tell us anything about housing, less as a binary, homeless or housed, yes or no, more as a spectrum, right? Like half the country is a paycheck away from not paying rent and is cost burdened. So I think we have to broaden our understanding of this issue. In terms of, I think the other part of your question is really around like, what's the implications of that? Like if we don't have that shift, to me, the perpetuating of homelessness and the dehumanizing of homelessness are one and the same. Uh, Great case in point. If you surveyed people, every survey, left, right, center, whatever your political affiliation, everyone is for ending homelessness. Everyone wants to see more resources and work done to end homelessness and thinks things are not going well and we need to do more. But then you also ask a question about like, well, how comfortable would you be to have an affordable housing development in your neighborhood? You know, uh, Maybe it's a shelter, tiny home village, right? Like if you aren't for affordable housing and development in your community within reason. Like we talk about local character. We're not talking about putting in a skyscraper, down the street from your local park, but like a duplex, a triplex, a small tiny home, a safe parking site, like something like that. If you're not for that, you cannot also be for ending homelessness because those two they're irreconcilable. And I think the fear that we have about housing, like what's the problem of having, it's property values, our kids, is it safe, an element coming into the community. And what I'd say is your family and your kids are much less safe with the current status quo. Like the amount of uh you know, needles on the ground, people, defecating on the sidewalks, the cost. Like if you're just a hard-nosed economist, oh, I'm just a cost person. We're spending anywhere from $40,000 to $80,000 per unhoused person per year to maintain them on the streets. Police, fire, emergency services, sanitation, shelters. It's ridiculous, right? So it's to me, it's a question of trade-offs of values, but it really begins by saying, well, gosh, once I know my unhoused neighbors as my neighbors and recognize that in California, 90% of the people who are homeless in California were once housed in California. Like our unhoused neighbors were once our housed neighbors. Once we get to see that and see them as someone's son or daughter, brother or sister, then we think, well, gosh, these are exactly the kind of people I'd want in my community. Resilient, resourceful, often very hardworking, often, a little bit self-effacing, like the shame and the notions of homelessness. A lot of our unhoused neighbors are really hard on themselves and they don't want to be a burden, right? So I just think once we get close enough to know them by name and not see it as us versus them, but see all of us, then I think it changes how the kind of policies and approaches to the issue that I think are needed.
There's a thank you for that. And so we need both. We need we really do need the change in heart as well as the systemic changes. I mean, I was mentioning about the legislators,
Yeah.
the recent legislation that is creating, some pretty significant barriers for the folks that we help, and not just that. I mean, you talk about the not in my neighborhood mentality of things, and look, I see that. I see why people might feel that way if they don't understand truly what the ramifications of that are. But
Mm-hmm.
in Louisville, we had a podcast recently with some folks from the metro government, and we were talking about the land development code,
Mm.
and it's basically zoned single family and commercial, and for for there to be change in that zoning to make
Mm-hmm.
it be a higher density type of property, whatever that might look like per square foot, does take a lot to do that. And certainly at the very least, it would take a public hearing, which we know what would happen at that public hearing. And
Mm-hmm.
so, and not just to mention that, but you'd have certain Metro Council members that would be against it as well. So when we talk about affordable housing, our mayor is talking about, 15,000 more units
Mm.
in a 4-year period, which is a wonderful goal to have. But there's a lot of barriers against that, aside from just the cost. 15,000 units is a lot,
Mm.
but also land development code. How do you
Mm-hmm.
almost have to pave the way for that to happen,
Yeah.
for us to have more to what you're describing. Uh, and we had Greg Colburn on early on. He had visited Louisville um, after talking about homelessness as a housing problem, his book. And, you just look at some of those basic barriers that are there that have to be dealt with for us to, I mean, we could change hearts and minds, but will that change policy? Will that change law? I, I don't know. I mean, you got to do both. Not sure which one comes first.
Yeah.
Probably neither one comes first. They both have to happen simultaneously.
Yeah. It's such a great area to think about and explore. Um, I think what I'd look to, so in the book, last chapter of the book, I share about a time in San Francisco's history where homelessness, there you go, you got it. You're not even underwater anymore and you're
Yeah,
right.
right.
It's good. I shared a time in San Francisco's history where homelessness was a lot worse for a brief period of time than it is today. And that was in the aftermath of the 1906 earthquake and fire.
Hmm.
And in a city of 400,000 residents, 250,000 people experienced homelessness. And it wasn't a period where we said, okay, well, hey, they should have had better fire insurance and earthquake coverage. And, those, they made a big mistake, or well, not in my backyard, they need to just go elsewhere, go down the road. Like, no, it was a time where people came together, erected emergency housing, changed some of the policies, developed the earthquake cottages, which are now scattered still in parts of San Francisco. And within 2 years, the last of the encampments closed in Golden Gate Park. And from a unhoused population, 250,000 people, everyone was able to get housed within 2 years. So I share that because I think in times of crisis, we actually start doing things with the kind of urgency that we need to do, because right now we're in a crisis. Like, we don't see it as a crisis because it's not as visible as an earthquake or a flood or a fire or, a global pandemic, recently. But we're in a crisis, and the people who are homeless can be much better thought of as survivors of a disaster. We just can't see the floodwaters or the
Mm.
flames. So I think I actually I'm not dismissing how complicated zoning laws, ordinances, building codes, what can be built where, CEQA, environmental reviews, community buy-in. This is all part of the process, but I think we have to look at moving with the kind of urgency that we almost instinctively do in times of disaster, because we're in a disaster right now. We're just not seeing it that way. So I think they go together. I think the hearts and minds have to change in order for us to commit to doing the work and caring enough to then enacting the policies. And sometimes you just need to get things done. And maybe it's, well, in the meantime, we're going to be fighting for affordable housing. We're going to be fighting for changing, zoning laws. In the meantime, let's get that tiny home village erected now. Let's get that safe parking erected now. Let's do some container ships. What can we do that's tangible? Because right now the status quo of just letting people live and die on the streets, that's unacceptable. So
Yeah. Yeah, no, and it's interesting to lead into that, or to carry on with that conversation. You have a part in your book that I noticed that was really interesting, called Toxic Charity.
mm,
And that it's easy. So, for instance, for us here at St. Vincent de Paul, we house, feed, and support those in need with compassion and dignity. All and again, the notion of that and the why around that will never change. That mission will never change. How we do it, what we do, yeah, that might change, but that mission will never change, and it has its roots and basis in Catholic social justice going back. We've been in Louisville 173 years, and long time, right? Doing really good work. But what we do and how we do it has changed in those 173 years. But it's interesting when we go out into the public and try to grab people's attention of what we're doing. It's easy to point them to and get them to understand. For instance, our open hand kitchen serves 11,000 meals a month, free to the public, open to everybody on campus as well as in the community. It's easy to get people to wrap their heads around the feeding aspect, or the fact that we've got an emergency med shelter that now is 24/7. It's no check-in, no check-out, which is different than all the other shelters in town, and has created opportunities and lowered barriers a bit more for the men that are there. But it was interesting in the book where you talk about shelter, hunger, food. You can wrap people's heads around that, but the permanent solutions, I find that hard to wrap people's heads around that,
mm,
because we have people living on our campus. We have apartments that are for folks that are at 50% below median income,
mhm.
and have a disability in their family. So 30% of their income could be, I mean, it could be zero, right? They'll never be able to pay rent,
Yeah.
right? But we're providing that housing. I mean, we don't have a permanent solution for that part of our population. And there's a lot of folks that are in that situation. So
Yeah.
maybe you can expound on that a little bit. I'm kind of pontificating here, but that whole notion of it's easy to just kind of, yeah, people need coats in the winter, they need hats and socks and gloves, and we can deal with that, but it doesn't get to the underlying issue and more permanent solution.
I, I think you pontificate away, my brother. It's very well said. You know, I'm very inspired by some of the Catholic social work, social welfare teachings. Um, you know, Dorothy Day, I think is someone I am inspired by, and I know she had at one point been asked when she was interviewed about the education program that she was leading, and was asked, well, some of these students are not Catholic, they're Jewish, right? Or they're coming from different faith traditions. Like, why are you educating them? And what she said, I think, is still holds value for today, which is that, well, we are we are educating them not because they're Catholic, but because we are. And I think when we think about this kind of like whack-a-mole approach to homelessness, okay, let's keep them alive versus, okay, the kind of investment we need. It's this same notion that I think Dorothy Day was able to recognize of the us versus them, that's trying to divide us. Like, if we're talking not about the abstraction of homelessness, but we're talking about your mom, your brother, your son. Suddenly, if someone said, well, just get them some shoes and like that, and then let them on their way, and hopefully they can get a job at McDonald's or whatever and work their way out of it, you'd say, well, I'm going to have something else to say to you, my friend, because how dare you? Don't you ever talk about my family like that? And right now in the US, like, oftentimes what's the alternative? We think, well, work your way out of it. If you're working full time at the federal minimum wage, uh, you will not be able to afford the median fair market value price for a two-bedroom apartment in any county of the 3,000 plus counties in the United States. And in less than 1% of counties would you be able to afford a one-bedroom apartment working full time at the federal minimum wage. So, right there, you almost have to say, well, what kind of society do we want to live in? Right? Like this, we talked earlier, you brought about some historical antecedents that we would not want to be compared to. But like, if we're thinking our kids, maybe even our grandkids, and they're like, wait a second, you commodified housing to a point where you saw it as just like investing in the stock market. And you were so focused on just the return on that investment that you created this, market that kept more and more people away from it. And it cost you more than if you had just provided housing. Like, that's the real rub. Like, we in the Clinton administration in the 90s, the amount of money that was uh, added into the budget for criminal justice, incarceration, growing the prisons in the United States is, I think, about 17, $19 billion. It was almost exactly the amount of money that was slashed from public housing in the United States. And so, in some real sense, prisons and incarceration, as I think Michelle Alexander writes in The New Jim Crow, became the kind of de facto public housing program in the US. And again, let's put morals aside, let's put politics aside. Simply as a cost benefit, hardened capitalist, that makes zero sense. Like,
Right.
that is so expensive, so wasteful of human potential of our neighbors. So my thing is, like, let's just make some hard but important choices. Let's make some investments in housing, and we're spending money either way. It's just whether we're spending money and enabling our neighbors to have a dignified life for their kids and grandkids having a better life expectancy than my uncle had as, 50 years old, or whether we're okay with the status quo. And I don't know too many people that are okay with the status quo. So that's my pontification for the morning.
Well, Kevin, thank you so much. And for your time, your spirit. I really appreciate you and have so enjoyed your book, When We Walk By, and I encourage everybody, this is a must read. And I do hope that someday we can get you to come and visit us here in Louisville. I think you'd find a community that's really trying to wrap their hands around this, and from different places and different perspectives and from different positions. But to your point, nobody would wish being unhoused even for one day on certainly anybody in their family, let alone their worst enemy. And we get that, and we're trying to do the best that we can here. And I look forward to sharing this with our board because they're on a journey with us as well. We just recently, and I'll let you have the last word here, but I think you'll be proud of us. And I'm proud of us, our board, for doing this, but we just added an individual to our board that had spent uh, maybe 25 years on the street.
40
And
years.
most recently lived in our emergency men's shelter. Now is on his own in an apartment. And he attended his first board meeting last week. And it's like E.F. Hutton. When he speaks, everybody listens because he's the only one with that experience.
I am proud of you. That's incredible. What an asset to have on the board.
I'll let Kevin, if you could just give us some parting comments, for our listeners. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you. Appreciate the great work, St. Vincent de Paul. Would love to come out to Louisville. So let's find a day and time and come on out, for an event or something. You know what I would just say, like this issue can be so characterized by doom and gloom. It's so complicated. Look at all these systems that are broken. Even this dude comes on this show. He wrote a whole book at all the ways everything leads to homelessness. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And I would just say, okay, I get that. And it can feel overwhelming at times. But right now in the world, there's so much that feels out of our control in our country, in the world. We're not going to get into the specifics, but we can all think about this stuff. This is actually not one of those issues. After 10 years, 11 years of doing this work, I feel more optimistic and hopeful than I did when I started this journey. And the one thing is getting close and staying close to people experiencing homelessness, getting to know by name at least one person, hearing their story. Because if you have a heart for this work, and you obviously do, if you're watching and listening to this program, you want to do something, but you often feel helpless and not sure where. Getting to know one person, using your mind, listening to what the context is, the resources. There's 100 people who are homeless. There's 100 contexts, situation stories for how they became homeless. But once we get close enough, getting proximate, getting relational, and if you want to do that through Miracle Messages, reach out, miraclemessages.org. We need phone buddies. We need volunteers. Reach out if you don't know how to do that. I actually believe that we'll get much further along on this crisis because then we'll actually know the person by name. And the same way that your board member has a kind of moral authority when they're speaking, well, then you're like, well, you know what? I haven't experienced homelessness, but let me tell you about my friend Mark. Let me tell you about my friend Andres. Here's his story. How do we make sure Andres never spends another night on the streets? And that's what I think the work to dedicate ourselves to. So,
Amen. Thank you, Kevin. It was a pleasure.
such a pleasure. All right.
Thank you, Kevin.
Tony, thank you for making this happen.
Yeah, we'll be in touch. Thanks a bunch.
Take care.
Thank
See you
you.
in Louisville. Bye.
Okay, all right, bye-bye.
Bye, Kevin.